Okay, so earning money. So we'll go through a few of the sort of words that you need to understand, the definitions. So the first one is gross earnings. Gross earnings are basically your earnings before any deductions are taken out. And deductions might include tax, they might include union fees, they could be sort of anything like that. But basically your gross earnings are your earnings before anything's removed from your pay. Net earnings is the one where we've already removed those things. So net earnings is basically your gross earnings take away any of those deductions. So it's how much money you're actually taking home from your pay. And that's similar to the concept of taxable income. This course unfortunately doesn't cover income. I might sneak it in somewhere because it's a life skill you should learn. But when you're working out your tax, we don't pay that on our gross income. We pay that on what we call our net income or our taxable income. And that's after we've removed allowable tax deductions. So they're a bit different to just any old deduction. They're things that we're allowed to not pay tax on effectively. Now, salary is the other word you need to understand. Salary is basically when you get paid a set amount of money per annum, which is per year, and you get paid that regardless of how many hours you've worked. And so that's generally associated with professional jobs or management level jobs. And in that case, it doesn't matter whether you work a 40-hour week or an 80-hour week, the pay you're going to take home is the same. The questions for salaries generally just relate to asking you to find what would be the weekly income or the fortnightly income or monthly income or so on. So you basically just get your salary and then divide it by 52 to find your weekly income, divide it by 12 to find your monthly income, or divide it by 26 to find your fortnightly income. Wages are basically when you get paid an hourly rate. So that's generally associated with trades and a whole lot of jobs where basically you just get paid per hour of work. Now, in its simplest form, that's as simple as to calculate your wages of getting the rate of pay that they've promised to pay you and timesing it by the hours worked. However, most of your questions, of course, are going to be a lot more complicated than that, and they're generally going to include what we call penalty rates. Now, penalty rates are basically overtime. And they'll generally quote them as being time and a half or double time. Time and a half is exactly what the name implies. It's 1.5 times, so 1 and 0.5 being your half, so it's going to be 1.5 times whatever your usual hourly rate is. That will give you the hourly penalty rate, and then of course you'd multiply it only by the number of hours that you get paid for. So the number of hours, usually it's the number of hours exceeding 8 hours or exceeding 10 hours, depending on the table of information that they give you, and that will depend on the industry that you're in and whatnot. Sometimes you'll get double time, so that's often, holidays, public holidays, Sundays, or sometimes if you've worked in excess of 10 hours or something like that. But you've got to read your questions really carefully. It's not a set thing. It varies from workplace to workplace depending on the agreements and the awards under which you work. So read your questions carefully. But if you had double time, then basically you're just going to do exactly as the name implies. You're going to double your normal rate. That doesn't apply to every single hour you work. It only applies to hours over a particular level. So always make sure you do your normal hours at the normal rate, and then only apply these double times or time and a halves to the hours that exceed whatever rate at whatever hours they dictate. Okay. On top of that, for wages, you might also need to add any bonus payments. That's usually for reaching a particular level of productivity or sales or something like that. Allowances, which generally are a set dollar amount, so they're not a per hour thing. That's usually a per day sort of thing, and that's usually for travel or food. If it's travel, it might not be a set dollar amount. For travel, it might be so many cents per kilometre or something like that. But often if it's an overnight trip or something like that, they'll give you a set dollar amount for being away from home overnight. Incentives are exactly as the name implies, just a bonus sort of pay, another word for bonus really, something that they give you which is linked to some kind of achievement. And leave loading is a common one. So leave loading pretty much everyone will get, and it's basically an extra percentage that they pay you over and above your normal hourly rate. It kind of compensates for the fact that you won't get overtime while you're on leave. So if you normally work a lot of overtime and a lot of your income comes from that, the leave loading kind of compensates for that a little bit. Now, for leave loading questions, you need to read the questions very carefully. If the questions asked you to calculate the loading itself, then what you're going to do is get the percentage, divide it by 100 to turn it into a decimal, and then times it by your usual pay. And what that will have calculated, I'm going to change colours there, is your actual loading. So and it's basically a percentage of question. So you get your percentage times it by the amount. However, sometimes the question might say how much are you going to get paid with the loading. So if they ask for the total pay, then what you're going to get is not just a percentage of, but you're going to do the 1 plus your percentage over 100. So it's basically your multiplier, a percentage increase, times your usual pay. Because that will then, timesing anything by 1 keeps the original amount, which is what you'd normally get, and then the plus the percentage on 100 bit will increase it to allow for that extra loading that you've been granted for your holidays. And usually that's only going to get paid for your 4 weeks of the year, or whatever your industry standard is for your holidays. So that's leave loading. I've also just put spreadsheets on this little list here to remind us that spreadsheets are going to be a fairly big part of this topic. I'm going to do those in a separate video because there's quite a bit to talk through in terms of how you operate spreadsheets for those who haven't done those before. So I'll deal with those questions in a separate video. Piecework is the other part of earning money. Piecework is basically when you get paid per unit of work instead of per hour. So it might be you might be picking fruit and it might be per box, or you might be a tiler or a whatever, painter or whatever, and you might get paid per square metre of whatever you've done, or it could be per thing that you've produced or whatever. So that's always a per something, and you'll just get however many units you've done times the rate per unit. Commissions are generally associated with sales, so things like real estate agents, salespeople of any description. And they're basically a percentage payment. So it's based on a percentage of whatever value you've sold. So generally you'll get not just the commission, but also what we call a retainer. A retainer is the set dollar amount that you'll get paid even if you sell nothing. So for example, if you're in real estate, you probably wouldn't expect to sell a house every single week, but the government won't allow you to starve to death. So they will pay you a set dollar amount, which is basically normally something like the minimum award wage for your age. And then on top of that, you would get the commissions for any sales that you make. Now these again, so commission is basically another example of a percentage of calculation where you're basically going to get the percentage that the commission is, divide it by 100 to turn it into a decimal number, and then times it by your sales. So if it's a very simple question, it's going to be as easy as that. However, for most of your questions, they're going to again be a little bit more complicated. So they might do things like having what we call incremental commissions, and that's where you're going to get paid a different percentage for different sort of levels or thresholds that you hit in your sales. So I've written you a little example here. So for example, if I was given this table, it tells me that for sales less than $10,000, I would receive 1%. But for all of my sales between 10,000 and 20,000, I'll receive 2%. And for sales greater than 20,000, I'd get 3%. So, for example, if I sold $8,000 worth of goods, my commission would just be that $8,000 times my 1%. Now, don't forget, percentages always need to be converted to a decimal, so 1 over 100, which would make your decimal answer 0.01. Now, also I'm going to add here that you should know how to calculate some of these things mentally. Don't avoid this because it's going to come around in exam time and you're going to need to do this. Hopefully you remember those golden rules that define 10% of any number, you're moving the decimal. If there's no decimal, it's at the end, one place for 10%, because there's 10 lots of 10% in any number. But to find 1%, there's basically 100 lots of 1% in any number, so I'm dividing by 100, so I'm moving my decimal 2 places. So in this case, even mentally, I could see that my answer for that 1% would be $80. So I've just moved that decimal 2 spots along to find that, and do make sure you can do that. Now, if I, however, let's say I had sales of 24,000, then I'm going to make use of all 3 of those tiers. So for the first $10,000 of my sales, I'm going to times that by 1%. So again, mentally, I'm moving that decimal 2 places, which means I'd get $100 for that first $10,000 worth of sales. And then I've exceeded the 20,000. So my next 10,000, so that all the sales between 10,000 and 20,000, I got 2% for those. So this 10% here was basically that whole band, that 20,000 take the 10,000, and that's where that... So I'll write that down. So that was 20,000 take the 10,000. It was basically just that second band. And then I'll get, for each of those dollars, I've got 2%. So again, mentally, I'm moving that decimal 2 places to find my 1%, and I've got double that. So I've doubled that to get my 200. And then I also had that extra 4,000 that exceeded the 20,000. So for that extra 4,000, I got 3%. So for that last one, I'd go 4,000 times 3%. And again, mentally, to find 1% is usually you're going to be able to work with 1%, 10%, or finding 10% harder to get 5 or whatnot. So for 3%, I'm going to move my decimal place, decimal 2 places, which would give me $40 for 1%. I've got 3%, so I'm then going to multiply that by 3 to get 120. And then I would just add all of those up, which in this case would give me $420 as my total commission. Do make sure you remember that and don't just apply that 3% to the entire 24,000, which is what the mistake that most people will make. Okay, I'm just going to pause there.